And there's not much of the story, Miss. You just need to know that there's a piper and he's incredibly cold and he's got broken boots and he's got a pair of nice boots with feet inside round his neck, hanging from his neck, and he's knocking on the door of the farmhouse and he's asking for some. Yes, said the farmer. I'm freezing out here, said the soldier. Can I come in and warm myself by the fire? Well, I don't know you. You know, paranoia isn't something just to do with the 21st century. You know, people have been afraid of strangers for centuries. He said, I don't know you, but I can't bring you in, you know, and besides my wife would be upset, and I was looking forward to a nice night in with my wife, you know, we're just having a warm and a whiskey. But I can't let you stay out here in this blizzard. He said, there's a barn on the far side of the farmyard. You can go in there and sleep. When he went in, it smelt like a barn, but in the corner, he heard a snoring, and in the corner was a cow on the straw. And he thought, well, that'll keep me warm. Cuddled up with the cow, took his boots and with the feet inside and put them on the other side of the cow to thaw out overnight. He was soon fast asleep, but I don't know, you know those people you share a bed with and they pretend they're a starfish halfway through the night. So you know, they're forever waking you up. Well, try sharing a bed with a cow. He woke up really early in the morning and he couldn't get back to sleep. So he went out over the other side of the cow and he squeezed the boots had thawed out. Fantastic. So he pulled out the feet. 1 foot. 2 feet. And he put on the boot. Oh, God, those boots were really comfortable. And he looked at the feet and he thought, I can have a bit of fun with these. And he put them in front of the cow's mouth. He went and hid in the hay. Well, a few hours later, in came the farmer just to see that the pipe was still alive, and he looked across and he saw the cow and he saw the feet in front of the cow's mouth. He went running back and said, wife, pack up a few things. We've got to leave. The cow has eaten the piper. Off they went, bundled up a few things, and off they left. And the piper, laughing like a drain, went in and sat down by the fire, stirred the embers of the fire, and great roaring fire came up. And then he took a bottle of whiskey and he was just about to pour himself out a glass when there was a knock on the door. The piper didn't even look round. He just said, come in, stranger, warm your feet by the fire. And the voice said, I would if I had any.
Right. It's a Hugh Lupton story or a Duncan Williamson story?
Well, it's Hugh Lupton's end. It's a Duncan Williamson story, and Hugh, the way that he does, adds ends on. And
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah.
Just before the mobile phones came in, there was a group of, they'd all been to university together, and now they'd left university 10 years before. So they were about 33, and they were all female, and there were 6 of them. And so they had a uni reunion. And they all came here to Shropshire, and there's a youth hostel down by the river, the place called Buildwood. And so they got one room with all 6 of them in, because that was all that they could get. And they dumped all their children, and some were married. One was even divorced in those 10 years. And they'd all got together, and they were such a happy time. It was the first time they'd all met together for 10 years. And you can imagine the gin came out as soon as they walked in the door, and they're all gossiping and talking and everything else. And they booked a meal at a table and at a restaurant just down the road. The taxi came, but one of them turned around, and she didn't know at the time, but she'd been caught. So she was about 11 or 12 weeks pregnant. And she was married and everything. It was good news and everything else, but she hadn't told anybody, but she wasn't feeling very well. So she said, look, she said, I'm just a bit off. Don't worry about it. I'll stay here. When you come back at 10 o'clock at night, I'll get up again and we'll sit round and we'll have a chat. So off you go for a meal. So the five went off for a meal down onto the Iron Bridge. Nice Italian it was, I was told. They do good Italians over here. They have Italian red wine and Italian ice cream afterwards and all sorts of things. But it was before mobile phones, what I said. And none of them had a camera. So one of them said, don't worry about it. I'll get a taxi and I'll drop back to where we are. I'll pick my camera and we'll have a photograph of the five of us here and we'll get the sixth one when she's finished. So she jumped in the taxi, came back, and she was going into the dormitory and she thought, well, I won't turn the light on because my friend is unwell. So I'll just sneak in and I'll pick the camera up. She knew exactly where it was and she went and got the camera, jumped back in the taxi. They finished their meal, had all the photographs taken, and it was about 10:30 when they got back to the youth hostel, and there were police cars and there were ambulances there and there was all sorts of things because the janitor had gone into the room and the one that had been left behind was lying on the bed with a knife straight through her heart. And it had gone straight through her heart and it had gone straight through to the wood underneath the bed. And she was stone cold dead. Well, you can imagine the furore. You can imagine everything. The police was there. The detective superintendent turned up and everything else. And the five, they were absolutely devastated. Their friend was there and everything else. And the detective, he came down and he sat down and he said, out of the five of you, which one of you came back to pick the camera up? And the one turned around and said, that was me. I didn't turn the light on because I didn't want to wake her up, but it was me. And he said, yeah, he said, we knew one. How did you know? He said, well, we know one came back. You better come into the room. And there was the young lady there in her mid-30s. She had a sheet over her. And to the one side, there was a great big mirror. And on the mirror, in lipstick, it had been written, it was a good job. You didn't turn the light on. So I thought I'd do a little ghosty story. It's a local one around Shropshire Ways. Okay. So I'm going to go to Maria and then I'm going to go to Kath. And as I go to Kath, I'm going to hand over. So I'm going to Maria first, then we're going to Kath. And then I've given Kath a list. You don't have to stick to that list. You just need to know who's been on, Kath, and I'm going to hand it over to you. Okay. So we're going to go to Maria all the way from Cork.
Sorry, Mike, there's just a couple of people who aren't on the list. Bob, did you want to tell?
Oh.
No, I'm a listener today.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. Sue, how about you? Are you telling? Okie dokie. That's
Sue,
everybody.
right.
Thanks.
Okay, and Catalina. Now we've got Catalina who's coming later. Are you going to have a go, Catalina? Are you listening? She's just listening.
Yes, just listening today, enjoying the story. Thank you.
Yeah, so where are you from?
I'm from Argentina.
Argentina?
Yes, I'm from Argentina and living in Warsasat.
Right, well, I think your rugby football team is over with us just about now. So with a bit of luck, we're going to give you a good thrashing when we play rugby union, okay? Right, so I'm going to go to Maria and then to Kath, and as Kath finishes, you're going to take over, yeah, mate?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to Cork. Where are you going?
Dis Muragata Gwynna Ushla, and hello from the Cork jury. It is lovely to see you this evening. So this is an atmospheric telling, and it's a story. I gather stories. I'm a drama therapist. So it's based on the Ceol Dríochta Corcaigh, which is the magic mists of Cork, and a tradition of, it'll be in the story. So I'm just going to tell you the story. People say that the Pishoga of yesteryear belongs there, the old traditions. And Mikey thought like this. His mother would say to him, Samhain is coming, boy. The veils are thinning, boy. Oh, be Cormac, be careful when you go out. And she'd be throwing the holy water after him as he left the door. And he'd be saying, for God's sake, ma'am, I don't believe in anything like that. And she'd say, but do you believe in the Ceodriach, the Corky, the magic mists of Cork that curl up from the Lee at this time of year? Yeah, that's the winds from Iceland, he said, hitting the warm earth of Ireland and causing the mists. Is it now, she said. Is that all it is? Will you not take any note of our traditions at all? None, he'd say, as he headed off out the door with his bicycle, forgetting to bless himself once more with the holy water proffered by his mother. But it was coming to Samhain Eve, and the great big full hunter's moon was up in the sky, and she was drawing from the wet waters of the River Lee to make the Ceodriach the Corky, the magic mists of Cork. And he couldn't help it. When he was out in the dark streets, he began to remember all the stories of his mother, and he put his hand up in case he would see anything at the wall, and then chided himself for the same. He passed the barracks that was built by Queen Victoria, now called Collins's Barracks, and it seemed that suddenly the world got older and went back in time, and the mists grew thicker and climbed the fever hospital steps of Cork. As he looked into the mists, because it felt like he couldn't look away, he could see things coalescing and melting back into the mist and coalescing again, until he saw the worried face of a man, gaunt with hunger. He looked grey in this light. Mikey started to go past him with his bicycle, but the man stood in his way, and in his hands he held something. Mikey couldn't help it. He looked at that box, and he looked at the dirty fingernails and the gnarled hands of the man that was holding it, and he noticed that his clothes were old style, thick and tweedy, and he smelt like farming. He took the corner of the box, for the man seemed to want him to do this, and when he looked inside, he could see the reason for the sorrow on the man's face. For there was a baby in this butter box, a baby who would never see life. Oh, said Mikey, and it was like it was drawn out from his stomach. Oh, he said, full of understanding, and the look that passed between the two men said that he would stand shoulder to shoulder with him and do what must be done. But Mikey didn't know what must be done. He turned on the lamp of his bicycle and he started to make his way down the fever hospital steps, and the man with the butter box walked behind them. They kept a funeral pace because that is what seemed was right. The mist began to take on a yellow tinge. Mikey didn't know whether it was from the street lights or was this the colour of the magic mist. They went down the oldest streets of Cork that wound and rose up towards Shandon. The Irish name Shandoon means the old fort. And when he got to the top of the hill and looked down, even in this thick mist, he thought, this is not my Shandon Street. Not one car was parked on the street. There was no street lights. And somehow the houses, though they looked more ragged, looked newer, as if they'd just been built. Down Shandon Street they went, keeping the funeral pace between them. And when they got to the end of Shandon Street, the man turned left. There was a graveyard there. But Mikey remembered his mother being absolutely apoplectic that they had tarred over the old graveyard. Surely it didn't exist anymore. Yet there it was. The man went in, and all that Mikey could see now were his head and shoulders floating above the mist as if he had no feet at all. He went towards the man, who had found a fresh dug grave. He took the earth carefully from the end of the grave and placed the butter box there. Then Mikey remembered. He remembered the old tradition that if a baby died before it could be churched, then it was up to the father to find a place to bury that baby so that the two souls could mind one another until the judgment day. He had found the soul that would bring his baby to heaven. Mikey looked into his eyes, full of grief and understanding, and he helped him to put the earth over that box as if they were putting a soft blanket to the chin of the baby. Then he heard himself say the old prayers, Arna Hiritarnav, go ne for danum, go dagad richt, go ne into the holler and talav, he intoned. And then the deed was done, and the man stood up. They were of one height, and they looked into one another's eyes. Then the mist started to come forward to claim the man. His face began to melt back into An Ceodriachta, the magic mist, come forward again, then disappear. When he was gone at last, Mikey came back to his senses. He threw his bicycle to the floor, ran out of that graveyard, turned left and went down towards the River Lee itself. There he could hear the noises of the city. His city. He could see the lights of the number 208 bus. I'm back, he said. Thank God, thank God. And he made straight for St. Mary's Church to bless himself with the holy water. Never again would he take the traditions of his people for granted, for he knew that he had been lost in time in the magic mists of Cork.
That's lovely. That's lovely. I've been to Cork. That's a beautiful place it is. Stuff full of the nicest people and the best Guinness you'll ever drink. Well, nearly the best Guinness.
The best Murphy's. Murphy's are Danish.
Right, so I'm going to hand over to Kath in all sorts of different ways because Kath it's now Kath's turn to tell a story, and as she finishes, she's going to take over the MCing. I'm going to jump in my truck and go and find my friend who needs a bit of backup for tonight. So I'm going to hand over and say goodbye and best of luck to you all. And I'll see you in a fortnight's time. Don't scare the bejesus out of yourselves too much, as they would say on the West Coast. Okay, over to you, Kath.
Give my regards to Fran. Oh, he's gone. Thank you. Is it Maria or Mariah, or how do you say your name?
It's Maria.
Maria,
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your lovely story. Yeah, exhilarating and atmospheric, Diana's just written. I quite agree. Beautifully put, Diana. It was indeed. Oh, lovely spooky story. This story of mine is slightly less spooky. It's a story from the 7th century. And like a lot of these stories, it purports to be true. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. St. Augustine, well, when he was just Bishop Augustine, was travelling around England to give support to the Christians there and to encourage everyone to become Christian. He'd been sent by Pope Gregory, much to his disgust. This isn't part of the story, actually, but Pope Gregory sent him from the warmth of Italy, where there was wine, there was beautiful food, there was sunshine, and he sent him to land on a muddy, cold Kent coast. I don't think Augustine ever got over it. But now we have him touring England to give support to the clergy. And he's come to a little village in Warwickshire, and he's talking with the vicar, with the priest. Now, the priest had quite a lot of complaining to do, because in those days there was no central fund to pay a vicar's wages. It was paid by subscription from the community, the tithe. They were meant to give a tenth of what they earnt or what they had to the church. So some paid in money, some paid in kind. And the priest was saying to Augustine, everybody, every single person in the village pays their tithes, except for the one person that I would expect to give a good example. The lord of the manor, he is actually a knight of the realm, and he's got more money than anybody, and he refuses to pay his tithes, and it's just not fair on anybody else. I have had to excommunicate him. Well, Augustine told the priest that he would go and call on the lord of the manor, call on the knight, and see what he could do. And so the next day, Augustine was shown into one of the knight's grand rooms, and then the knight came in, and he was quite surprised to see this man who was in contrast to the priest. His clothes were rich compared with the priest's well-worn clothes. His bearing was upright and almost regal, and his manner was confident. And Augustine said to the knight that he'd come to talk to him about paying the tithes, and the knight clearly had a well-rehearsed speech. He said, I pay men to sow the corn on my land. 3/4 of it is eaten by the crows, and the quarter that grows, well, I pay men to reap it. I pay men to stack it. I pay men to do everything that they do on my land. And it seems to me that the 10th sheaf of corn is as much mine as the other 9. So no, I do not care to pay the tithes, and I don't care who you think you are. Now you had better leave before I lose my temper. And Augustine did indeed turn to leave. And just in the doorway he turned and said, I'm leading the service in the church tomorrow. And then he went. Well, the knight was left to ponder. Why had Augustine said that? Was there going to be something special in the service? Well, of course, the knight wasn't actually meant to go because he'd been excommunicated, but his curiosity got the better of him. And so next morning, all the villagers were gathered in the church, and there indeed was Augustine in the pew. And the door flung open, and in slouched the knight, looking truculent and petulant, and he plonked himself down in the pew at the back. St. Augustine surveyed his congregation, and he said, let anyone who has been excommunicated leave this place. And first of all, the knight just sat there looking surly, and then everybody in the village turned round and stared at him. And after a while he muttered, oh, all right then. And he grabbed hold of the pew in front of him, the back of the pew in front of him, so that he could stand up. And it's just as well he was holding on to that pew, because the floor of the church started trembling. And he sat back down with a thump, and everybody's eyes turned to the aisle. And in the centre of the aisle, the stone flags were starting to heave. And then with a sound like thunder, one of the stone flags flew up and landed again on the floor, leaving a dark hole. And a grey skeletal hand came out of that hole and grasped the edge, and then another hand, and then up rose a head, and the skin on this head was grey too, and falling away in places. The hair was thin, and there was earth crumbling away from the hair. The eyes were like the eyes of a dead fish. And this creature, this dead creature, continued to heave itself out of the ground until it was kneeling on the church floor. And then, as if it had not moved for a long, long time, it heaved itself to its feet. Everyone was surprised to see there was a gold chain around its neck. And the man's clothes, the dead man's clothes, even though they'd clearly also been underground for a long time, they had once been expensive. And then with a voice like the tearing of old parchment, the dead man said, "I will go." And he turned and started to shuffle down the aisle towards the door at the back. But Augustine hurried down from the pew and he put his hand on the dead man's arm. He said, "Wait, what is your story?" And the dead man said, "I was once a knight in this place, and I would not pay my tithes, and I did many other wicked things besides. And the priest at that time excommunicated me, so that when I died, I went to hell. And that is where I am now." Augustine said, "Where is that priest now?" And the corpse lifted its grey dead hand and pointed out of the church door to the churchyard. And so Augustine walked with the dead man, and the knight followed. The three of them left the church and they went to the graveyard, the churchyard. And the dead knight pointed to the grave, which did indeed have a headstone, but it was a priest of 100 years before. And Augustine said prayers over that grave, and the surface of the grave began to tremble, and it began to heave. And then up from the grave came first a hand and an arm, and then, now heaving himself out of his grave, and now standing up in front of them, there was indeed a priest. And Augustine said, "Did you excommunicate this man? I think perhaps he now regrets his sins." And Augustine and the living knight watched this man, this dead man, fall to his knees and beg forgiveness of the priest. And he began to confess all of his sins, which took some time. And then the priest, who had risen out of the grave, he made some signs over the man's head, and he said, "I absolve you of your sins. You may now go to your rest, go to your peace." And Augustine and the knight, they heard a sound like a rusty saw being dragged through hard timber, and they looked at each other, and then they realized it was the dead man sobbing. And once more he heaved himself to his feet and he shuffled back to the church, and from the sound of a flagstone thudding back into place, they knew he had returned to his grave. And Augustine turned to that old dead priest and he said, "You have done a wonderful thing today. You have saved that poor man's soul. What I would like to do is say prayers so that you may be returned once more to your living form, so that you may return to earth and you may continue to save souls in the way that you have just done? Would you like me to do that? And the priest said, no, I bloody wouldn't. I want to go back to sleep. Thank you. And he turned and he climbed back into his grave, and he lay there looking quite content as the earth closed over him. And now it was the turn of the living knight to fall to his knees, and he confessed all of his sins, and he took quite some time. And Augustine did absolve him of his sins. And the story goes that that knight never returned to his manor. He gave away all his lands, all his goods, all of his money, and he became a monk, and he travelled the land preaching the word of God. Well, I don't know whether he did or whether he didn't, but that is the story. Thank you. And now, I'll just tell you the running order that Mike's given me so that you know when it's your turn. It'll be Simona, Diana, Baba, Marika, and Gary. Is that okay with everybody? So,
Yes, I won't be telling a story. I'm just here to listen.
who said that? Sorry.
Marika, I'm here.
Oh, Marika. Oh, okay. Oh, right. I will cross you off the list.
Okay,
Right.
thanks, because that would be scary for me today.
Rightio.
Thank you.
So, Simona, would you like to tell us a story?
Yeah, but actually, I don't have a spooky story today. It's a story about autumn. Is that fine? Yeah?
Of course.
Okay. So, long, long ago, there lived a family of hedgehogs. And one day, Mommy Hedgehog was walking in the woods with her 3 little kids. And it was a bright and sunny day in autumn, and the leaves under their paws were wet with morning dew. They were walking and enjoying the sunshine when suddenly they heard somebody crying in the distance. They looked at each other and they decided to follow the voice. So they walked in the woods until they came under a big chestnut tree. And they heard that it was the chestnut tree that was crying. Oh, not again. Please, please go away. Leave me alone. I only have 4 left. Please, please leave me alone. And the chestnut tree started sobbing. Please go away. Leave me alone. And Mommy Hedgehog and the 3 little kids looked up, and they saw a squirrel running down from the tree and going away. Oh, he stole another one. He stole another one, cried the tree. And so Mommy Hedgehog looked up at the tree and asked, what's wrong? What happened? You're such a beautiful tree. You shouldn't be crying like that. Tell me, what's wrong? How can I help you? Oh, cried the tree. That greedy squirrel is stealing all of my chestnuts. I have only 3 left on my branches. What can I do? I cannot even protect my fruits. Oh, said Mommy Hedgehog, let us help you. But how can you help me? You're just a little hedgehog with 3 little hedgehogs. How can you help me? I'm a big tree and I cannot even protect myself. You need protection, said Mommy Hedgehog. What do you think? Do you think that we'll just go away and leave you here like that? No, we'll at least try. And so she turned to her kids and she whispered something to them. And then the 3 little hedgehogs started climbing up the tree. And Mommy Hedgehog looked around at the other trees. Some time passed, Suddenly, she heard the rustling sound of the leaves on the ground. She looked and she saw the bushy tail of a squirrel disappearing behind a tree. So she looked and she looked, and suddenly the squirrel went out from the tree and started running towards the chestnut tree. And Mommy Hedgehog ran towards the squirrel, and ouch! The squirrel cried out in pain. Ouch! You hurt me! What are you doing here? Go away! You hurt me with your spiky spines. Oh, I'm so sorry, Squirrel. I never meant to hurt you. I was just walking in the woods and I didn't see you. Well, now just go away. I have something to do. There are 3 chestnuts left on that chestnut tree, and I want them for me. And so the squirrel started running again, and he climbed up the chestnut tree trunk. And the chestnut cried out, please, please, go away, leave me alone. But the greedy squirrel kept running up the tree trunk, and he rubbed his hands looking at the big chestnut that he saw on the branch in front of him. And then he jumped with his hands stretched in front of him, with his paws ready to grab the chestnut that he saw. And he was ready to catch it, and ouch! The squirrel fell to the ground and he ran away. What happened? Asked the chestnut tree. What? I don't understand. What happened? Mommy Hedgehog walked towards the tree, and she looked up and she smiled at one of her kids that was slowly uncurling from the chestnut he had protected with his body. I'm so proud of you, my kids. Now come down. The 3 little hedgehogs climbed down from the tree. But, said the chestnut tree, you managed it. You protected me. And how can I thank you? You shouldn't thank us, said Mommy Hedgehog. It was a pleasure, but you have to protect yourself, because we cannot always be here with you to protect you. Said the chestnut tree. You gave me an idea. And suddenly there was a big gust of wind, and all the leaves on the chestnut tree started trembling. And when the wind calmed down, Mommy Hedgehog and the 3 little kids looked up, and they saw that a bird had appeared around the 3 remaining chestnuts. And this is why chestnut spurs are as spiky as a hedgehog's spikes.
Thank you very much, Simone. I've never heard that story before. I've never also seen a squirrel portrayed as a Bond villain. I think that was great characterization. Thank you very much. So next it's Diana. Let's welcome Diana. Hooray!
That was great, Simone. I love that. So, right, I do have a spooky story, and here we go. There were once 2 tailors, brothers, in fact. The eldest was Sam, and the youngest was Peter. And Sam was very protective of his younger brother. It had always been like that, ever since they were very young. And Peter had been born a cripple. When it was time, when he was a year old, he wasn't able to walk. He never, ever had that capacity. So understandably, Sam wanted to protect him, and he always did. But Peter was able to fend for himself, really, and he learned to sew because his older brother showed him how to do that, and he became very good at it. And so the 2 of them ran a tailor's shop in a little village not far out of a bigger place. And near to there was also a pub. Now, these people worked hard. They had lots of mending to do, and it was at the time when there were no sewing machines. So it was all to be done by hand, and they were very neat and they were very careful. But of course, it took time. But they had a plentiful supply of work because their work was of a very good standard. Well, sometimes when the weather got colder, they would go out of a Friday night or maybe even a Saturday, and they would go to that pub that wasn't too far away. And they locked up the shop, and Sam would push his younger brother, Peter, in the wheelchair, the old-fashioned wheelchair, and they would chat as they were going along. And Peter always took some sewing with him because he would be pushed into the table and he couldn't move around like his brother and chat to all different people. So he would be content listening to all the crack, listening to the stories, being warm by the fire and doing his sewing. Now, these brothers were really quite, well, they were similar in some ways. They were both talented with the sewing with a needle and thread, but they were quite different. Sam every week would go to church and he was a fervent believer. But Peter, he never went. And he would never talk about it. And neither would Sam. That was the one thing they would never, ever talk about. They were both so different in approach. Well, anyway, Peter was sitting in the wheelchair and Sam was pushing him along, and they eventually got to the pub. And when the door was opened, a blast of hot air came out. Oh, that was great because it was nippy outside and it was just starting to rain and it was a little bit windy. So they were glad to get inside. And Sam pushed his brother Peter under his wheelchair under the table. And of course, he got out his sewing. And his brother got him a drink and then he got one for himself. And well, there were plenty of people there, so it was a grand night. And they were exchanging tales. And it was just that time of year when it was getting dark that bit earlier. It wasn't too far away from Hallows Eve, All Hallows Eve. In fact, that was the following night. This was the Friday, All Hallows Eve was the Saturday. So the stories were coming out and they were all about ghosts and spirits and well, Peter said, I don't believe in any of that. But Sam, he did. You might say he was a little bit superstitious, or maybe it wasn't superstition. Maybe he really did believe deep down in his heart. But anyway, the stories were going around, and suddenly out of the blue, one of the company said, I will give whoever is willing to go to the local graveyard and stay there for a few hours on All Hallows Eve, I will give him 5 gold sovereigns. And everybody hushed. It was completely quiet. This sort of thing didn't happen very often. And well, the hubbub started up again. But shortly after that, the barman stood up. And the barman was about to utter something, and everybody was always quiet when the barman stood up. Just in case, he said, 3 drinks on the house. But no, he didn't say that. He said that he would also add another 5 sovereigns, making 10 to whoever would go in the graveyard around about midnight, around about the witching hour, for at least 2 or maybe 3 hours. Well, there was no way Sam was going to put his name forward. But surprise, surprise, Peter said, count me in, I will do it. And Sam looked at his brother and thought, what are you doing? I spent all my time looking after you and you go and put your name forward for something stupid like this. Well, Peter was determined and it wasn't the place to have a huge argument. So it was decided that the following night, Peter would go, he'd be taken in the wheelchair by his older brother Sam and put in the graveyard. And then several hours later, his brother would go back and check him. And they would know, I mean, what could a cripple do? He was stuck in his wheelchair. Now, on the way home from the pub that night, Sam was really annoyed He said to his brother, "What do you think you are doing, putting your name forward for that? No one else did. Don't you realize?" Peter said, "I might be younger than you, but I know my own mind and I'm not scared and I'm going to do it." And that was the end of the conversation. So after that, they walked home and got wheeled home in silence. Well, it was a bit blowy and it was a bit rainy. So they actually wanted to hurry home anyway. But when they got home, they each went to their own bed. And in the morning, Sam tried again. But he had a different approach and he said, "Peter, look, you don't need to prove anything. You know, why are you going to do this? You can easily back out. It won't be a problem. There'll be no loss of face. They're all people that we know." And Peter said, "No." And that, the way he looked at his brother with steel in his eyes, it was a definite no. So later on that day, they got ready. Now it was quite cool outside, so Peter was well covered up, and his brother made sure, being the protective older brother, that he had a couple of blankets as well. And Sam himself was all dressed up for the cold. And on the way to the graveyard, they met in with 3 friends, because that had been the agreement, so that everyone would know it was all fair and square and there wasn't any just trying to get the sovereigns on the sly. So they got to the graveyard. And well, where would he go? And Peter said, "Put me over there in the corner. It'd shelter me from the wind and the rain." And it was beside quite a large granite stone. And the moon was directly above, so he could see because he brought some sewing with him. So there he was. And well, Sam went off. He wasn't happy at all. He really wasn't happy, but what could he do? His brother was being so stubborn. But Sam and the others went off to the pub, and it was quiet and still, and he got some sewing done because it was so quiet. But he could see well from the light of the moon. And then he heard ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, until it reached the midnight hour, 12. And well, that was the witching hour. But still all was quiet and there wasn't anything really happening. And as Peter looked about, he was feeling quite pleased with himself. And then, in front of this old granite stone, he looked and he saw a mound. And he wasn't sure if it was the way the light was falling, but it looked like this mound was moving. And also like this mound was getting bigger. And he looked and he stared and he was sure he wasn't seeing things. And then out came a hand. A hand. Do you see this? And the hand was waving, and all he could see in front of him was 2 sunken pits for eyes and a bony head, and this hand waving. And the tailor said, "I see this, and I sew this." And he just looked up for long enough to glimpse the hand, because he didn't look longer. And then the other hand went up. "Do you see this?" And the tailor said, "I see this, but I sew this." But actually his sewing was getting, the stitches were getting longer, because he was really quite taken aback and he didn't know what to do. And he was in his wheelchair, and how would he possibly get out? But he kept on sewing and he kept on sewing, because that was all he could do to concentrate and take his mind off And then clunk! One of the hands threw a stone, but the tailor ducked, and the granite stone split down the middle. And well, his wheelchair was knocked over, and he was out of it. And what was he going to do? And he was terrified, and he didn't want to look back. He couldn't look back. He tried to get up. He fell over. He tried again. He kept on trying. And eventually he got his balance, and he got down that road as fast as he could. And he got to the pub, and the door opened. And they all saw him. And all the mouths were open. This was the tailor. This was the crippled tailor. What was he doing here? How could he be there? Well, of course, it was All Hallows Eve, where thinness of veils come into play. But then he asked for a drink, and he got one the barman gave him. And once he'd had his drink, the tailor said, well, he told the story of this skeleton and how it had come out of the earth and waved his hands, and how he'd fallen out of his wheelchair when he'd thrown the stone, and how he just kept going. And he wasn't a cripple anymore. And it was quite amazing. No one quite knew what to make of it. And he never went back to the graveyard at that time of night again. But he was found in the precincts of the church. He was found on a Sunday morning, sitting on a pew inside the church every Sunday after that. Because now he believed. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Diana. I have not heard that version of that story before. I mean, it's sometimes called the Sprightly Tailor, isn't it? There's a story that's similar, but I never heard that version.
Okay, that's probably bits of me in there.
And why not?
But yeah, the Tailor and the Skeleton was the source that I had, and it was Duncan Williamson. So
oh, right, okay. I think it's so interesting the way how, as storytellers, there's all kinds of ways we can create atmosphere. And I loved that moment that I think probably most of us have experienced when it's a chilly night and it's coming on to rain, and you open the door of the pub and there's that blast of warm air. That was really, really, really atmospheric in a different way. Thank you very much, Diana.
Thank you.
Now we have two more tellers this evening. We have Gary and we have Baba C. Baba C has very kindly allowed Gary to go next because Gary is cooking his dinner. Also, I mean, Gary, why would anybody want to eat rather than tell stories? I don't know, but apparently I know. What can you do? But that's what Gary is going to do. So, Gary, do you have a story for us?
Hi, Cass. Yes, I do. And I've been cooking tea, and it was, I don't know, I just got my timing completely wrong. And I'm in the very fortunate position to be able to tell the story and then go and eat. So there you go.
Excellent.
I'll get both.
Excellent. So you've got both.
Yeah, and my thanks to Barbara for stepping aside and letting me tell my story now. And I remember Kevin Crossley Holland's version of the story that we just had there, Billy. Yeah, and it came a point in the story when I know what this story is, but I hadn't heard that version either, so that's great. Thank you. Oh well, okay. So my story. I live in Cornwall. For those of you that know me, you know that's where I live. But there'll be people out there that don't, and there'll be people out there that have never been to Cornwall. But I live just on the coast. I live in Falmouth, and about 30 miles up the road is Bodmin, and just beyond Bodmin is Bodmin Moor. And I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's a moor, you know, and it's like big granite rocks up there, and it stretches out into the dark night. And there's tiny little roads that run zigzag all the way across it, and little villages and little farmsteads. And on one of those roads between Bodmin and Liskeard, or Liskeard, as they say, or Liskeard, the more you get in there, the more Cornish you are. Anyway, up there in the hills on one of those back roads is a little farmstead, and and I couldn't take it there because I can't remember the way. But anyway, up there lives Tom, and Tom's an old fella. He's been living up there all his life. Basically, he was born on the farm and he was raised on the farm. And he's worked the farm all his life, and he's still there now. And I think must be in his late 80s at least. And he's got family that live down in Bodmin, and they've always said to him, you know, Pa, what are you doing living up there in the hills all by yourself? You should come down here and live in Bodmin with us in case something happens, you know, because if it did, by the time we got there, well, who knows? But old Tommy would say, no, my handsome, I lived here all my life. I was born here, I was bred here, I lived here forever, worked the farm, and I'll die here, and I'll be happy. Just leave me alone. So in the end, they did leave him alone. Well, he was happy enough living up there, and he had his routine. He'd get up in the morning, feed the chickens, and look after the other animals, and do whatever he had to do all day. And then he wasn't one for staying up all night and wasting time. Once darkness fell, he'd finish his supper, and then he'd take himself off to bed. And anyway, in the days that this story took place, there wasn't much else to do anyway. So I don't know why I even mentioned television, because I don't think they'd been invented. But anyway, there he was, living up there all by himself. And this one particular night, it was no different from any other night, though it was like this time of year. And he'd finished his supper, and the embers of the fire had died down, and he'd lit his candle, and he'd locked up, and he took himself off up to bed, and he climbed into bed, and he did what he did every night. Was it by the light of his little candle? He would like read a couple of pages of the Bible, and then he'd close the Bible. He'd always do that just in case, and then he'd go off to sleep. And this night was no different. So there he was, read his Bible, closed the book, put it on the side, blew out the candle, and lay his head down to rest. And he was just in that bit, you know, that bit where you just drift in between being awake and being asleep. And he was just in that moment there. And then he heard a strange noise, sort of. Well, actually, the noise that he heard, first of all, wasn't so strange, but it was strange that it was happening. It was the creaking of his barn door. Like the door was opening, and he thought, I'm sure I locked that door before I went to bed, before I closed up the house. I'm sure I did. And he said to himself, I must remember oil those hinges in the morning, but why is the door opening at this time of night? So he decided to get out of bed and go over to his window and look out and see what he could see. So he got out of bed and he went over and he pulled back the curtain and looked out across the farmyard. And well, there in the sky, the moon was dancing with the clouds, and he could see by the moonlight the door was closed. Well, that was strange, he said. It must have been the wind. But he went back to his bed and he climbed back into bed, and well, he pulled up the covers and he put his head down on the pillow, and he was just drifting off again. And as he was just drifting off again, he heard another noise. And this time it was the creaking of the gate to his garden. He said to himself, I must remember to oil those hinges in the morning. I'm sure I locked that gate before I locked up the house, he said, but I don't know. Why is it opening now? So once again, he got out of bed and he went across the window. He pulled back the curtain. He looked down. No, he looked down. No, there was nothing there. The gate was closed. Well, what? Well, it must have been the wind, he said. So he closed the curtain and he went back and he got into his bed and he lay his head down once again, and he was just lying there. And then he heard another noise. That was his kitchen door opening. He was absolutely certain that he'd locked the kitchen door before he'd gone to bed. And he said to himself, I must remember to oil those hinges in the morning. But I better go and see why that. And he got out of his bed and he went and he looked down. There was nothing there. It must have been the wind. It must have been. So he climbed back into bed and he pulled up his covers and he was just nodding off to sleep. And as he was nodding off to sleep, then he heard a different sort of noise. You know, It did sound like the wind, you know, like the wind when it hooks itself around the corners of the house and kind of tickles the edges of the house. That kind of noise. It was that kind of noise. It went on a bit though. It went, I am the ghost of the bleeding finger, and I am coming. That wasn't the wind. The old man pulled his sheets up to his chin, and he could hear the door at the bottom of his stairs opening, the latch and the hinges. I said, I must remember to oil those hinges in the morning. And he heard the noise again. I am the ghost of the bleeding finger, and I am coming. And he pulled the sheets up to his nose. He's lying there in his bed. When he looked, he could see under his door, the bedroom door out in the hallway, a strange blue light. And the door to his bedroom started to open, and the room went an icy cold. But in one swift move, he had leapt out of his bed with his blankets, and around him he dived underneath the bed and was lying under the bed with his curled up like in a tight ball with his blankets pulled tight around him. He heard the voice again. I am the ghost of the bleeding finger, and I am coming. He stood lying under his blankets, pulling them as tightly to him as he could, and he didn't know what to do, and he was terrified as he felt icy cold tendrils come underneath the blankets and sheets and wrap themselves around his fingers and began to prise his fingers open. And as his fingers were prized open, then the sheet was pulled back from his face, and he lay there on the floor looking up into the face of a terrifying spectre who looked down upon him. His face was waving, and some strange otherworldly wind, and his hair waving above him. This dark, empty, pitiless pit of eyes looking down into his own eyes, his chin wobbling from side to side. And the creature looked at him and said, I am the ghost of the bleeding finger. Have you got a bandage, please? Because it really hurts. And that is my tale.
That was lovely, Gary. The only thing is, my partner's gone to the Lake District for the weekend, so I've got to sleep on my own tonight. So thanks for that, Gary.
Well, thank you for hearing my tale, and thank you for letting me go at this point. My food is ready. Baba, I'm going to watch your story on catch up. I'm really sorry, but it's been a great night. Thank you all very much.
So Cass, just
Not a
make sure you've
problem.
got your first aid box next to you.
Oh,
With the
that's,
bandage.
that's a good point, actually. Well, the thing is, John, he's taken the first aid box with him. What am I going to do?
Oh, rip
I'll have to improvise.
rip a strip off a petticoat.
Yes, I'll have to rip a strip.
Office
Yes,
tape and
time-honoured
cotton.
fashion.
Office tape and cotton wool.
Maybe that'll do.
And Gary, I will never follow you again.
That might be a
No,
blessing.
just kidding. Just kidding. Just kidding.
I have to go. I'll see you later. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Gary.
Enjoy.
Enjoy your meal. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So, Kat, am I up?
You are. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our last teller of the evening. So would you please welcome the wonderful Baba C. Ray.
Oh. Okay. So I never dismiss when people say they've seen a ghost, because I have seen a ghost. I never dismiss other people's, they say one person's religion is another person's superstition. But as a babe sitting in those high chairs they feed babes in, I must have been ill. I remember it was late at night, and my mom was giving me something, I think prescribed by the doctor. I think it was Coke syrup. We won't get into that. But when you're asthmatic, yes, we will. When you're asthmatic, back in the day, they used to give babies Coke syrup, allegedly made from the same thing they make Coca-Cola from. But I remember watching two fairies dance on the lip of the table of my high chair. And when I was older, my grandmother on my mother's side took us to the remains of what we locally called a castle. It was a small mansion. And we were having picnic, my grandmother, myself, and my eldest sister and brother. But I'm the eldest, but my sister and my brother. And while we were in the middle of having our picnic, I looked up and saw a skeleton waving at me. So I never really dismissed those things, which has nothing to do with my tale. Now, last week, I told an urban version of a very telling tale indeed. But today, my tale takes a different vein. The Texas family owned a tiny house, which is not to be confused with an RV. A tiny house is what it says. It's a house on wheels with all of the amenities of home. But the Texas family loved to travel, so they lived in a tiny house. There was Dakota, the son, Georgia, the daughter, Nevada, the mother, and the father was Dave. Well, they traveled to and fro, and they loved having the experience where they were going to celebrate Hallows Eve or Halloween with family. But they got caught in the storm of storms. I mean, it was a storm. It stormed. You get it? I mean, it was literally raining cats and dogs, which historically has happened at least 3 times. So they're driving along, and the GPS goes out, and they're driving down the highway. They can't see. It's gotten so dark that in spite of the high beams on the tiny house's front, they can't see where they're going. And somehow they wind up off the main highway, and they're traveling on an old road, and they don't know what they're going to do. And the lightning bolt of all lightning bolts and the mother of all thunder shook and lit up the sky. And then it was absolutely black as night, because it was. But off in the distance, they could see a light. And so they began to drive toward the light. And as they got closer to the light, they were able to barely make out a structure. And they pulled up to the structure, and it was a hotel that had seen better days. It was a small hotel. And evidently, this hotel was on the old main way before they built the new highway. But there was a light in the window. And as they pulled their tiny house up to the hotel, a door opened, and a figure stood with a lantern and beckoned for them to come in. Well, you didn't have to tell them twice. So Dakota, Georgia, Nevada, and Dave dashed out of their tiny house into the hotel because it would give them more protection against the storm. And the storm only got worse. The windows on the hotel would quake and rumble every time there was thunder. And lightning, in spite of the fact that they pulled the curtains, and the curtains were black, they had pulled the curtain across the windows, they could see light through the curtains. And the rain came down so heavy, it sounded like their own personal thunder. Now, the hotel, or the innkeeper, the man and wife who ran it, their names were the Graves. They were the Grave family. And they said, "Oh, you are so lucky to have gotten out of that storm. And you look so wet, and are you hungry?" And of course, they all said they were hungry. And so she said, "Well, I have robes you can wear, and we can wash your clothes, and we'll eat while your clothes are washing and drying." And so that's what they did. They all changed out of their clothes, put on nice, soft, comfortable robes, and they sat down, and Mr. and Mrs. Grave went back and forth between the kitchen and a very large table, bringing out pot after pot, plate after plate of marvelous food. The adults had wine, the children had apple cider, the soft kind. And they sat and they told stories. Now you would think they would know better than to try to spook each other out on such a spooky night. But they told tales. They told the story about One-Armed Jack. They told the story about One-Eyed Mike. They told the story of the headless man who had no horse. They told tale after tale that were terrifying and spooky, and they got so spooked up that nobody wanted to go to their individual rooms. So the family camped out in a great big master room, a master suite, and they all slept within proximity of each other. The next morning, when they awakened, there was no sound of storm. There was no sound of thunder. There was no cue of lightning. And Mr. and Mrs. Grave had prepared an early morning feast. And so Dakota, Georgia, Nevada, and Dave, Texas, sat down and had the breakfast of breakfast. Now, Dakota was a vegetarian, but he ate everything they served without complaint. So finally, Mr. and Mrs. Grave fixed a great big basket of food for them to take along the way, just in case their refrigerator and electrics in their tiny home were still on the blink. So they took the big basket and they bade them. They tried to pay, but Mr. and Mrs. Grave would have none of it. And they boarded their tiny home and began slowly to pull away, looking at the damage caused by the storm. There were branches and fallen trees and big potholes of muddy water, and they made themselves very carefully down the old byway back to the major highway. And when they got to the major highway, there were police and ambulances everywhere, cars everywhere, and they were flagging people through one at a time, one at a time. And they noticed the out-of-state plates on the tiny home, and one of the deputies pulled them aside and said, "All the other traffic here is local. How did you get here?" Because the access road, the bridge, was washed out by the storm. And so Dave said, "Well, we were following our GPA. We were on the way to relatives to celebrate Hallows Eve, and now we've lost our opportunity to celebrate it with our family. But we were on the way. The GPS gave out. It stormed so bad we could barely see in front of ourselves. And so we took a side way. We took a side road. Must have been the old byway. And we made our way to, we saw a light in the distance. And we went, and it turned out to be a hotel. A very small hotel, but a hotel nonetheless. And there was a man standing with a lantern in his hand, and he bade us enter, and we did. We ran. I mean, but even though it was only a short distance, we were soaking wet by the time we got inside. And so they offered us shelter for the night because it was safer than staying in our tiny home, and they fed us, and we wore these robes, and they gave us food, and we told stories. We had a marvelous time, and then this morning we got back into our tiny home, and we very carefully made our way back here. The deputy looked at him and said, "Are you sure that you were at a hotel?" "Yes." "What was the name of the hotel?" "Well, I think it was called the Graves Hotel. It was run by Mr. and Mrs. Graves." "Mr. and Mrs. Graves." "Yes." "You stayed at the Grave Hotel?" "Yes." "And somehow you got here even though the bridge is washed out?" "Yes." "They even gave us a big basket to take with us." Mr. Texas, I'm not saying that I doubt your word, but would you humor me? Would you and your family follow me back in your RV? It's not an RV, it's a tiny house. I stand corrected. Would you follow me back? Or would you lead me to where you said you stayed the night? "Oh, sure, no problem, no problem." And so Dakota, Georgia, Nevada, and Dave, Texas, got in their tiny home, and they began to drive, and they got off the highway onto the old byway, and they drove very, very, very carefully. And once again, the GPS went on the blink, and they drove very carefully, and very, very carefully. until they pulled up to the ruins of an old building. Dave got out of his tiny home. He looked. The deputy got out of his squad car and he looked. He says, "This is the place?" "Yes." "You stayed in these ruins?" "No, last night when we were here, this was a hotel. It was a small hotel. It was the Grave Hotel, run by Mr. and Mrs. Graves." Mr. Texas, we don't take kindly to folk wasting police officers' time. Are you sure you hadn't had a few? "Well, last night, my wife and I had some wine, and the children had apple cider, the soft kind." "And you stayed here?" "Yes, but there's nothing here. There was last night." Uh-huh. Now, do you have any drugs in your tiny house that I should be aware of? Any mushrooms or any little tablets that you pop in your mouth that make you hallucinate? Do you have any homemade beer or homemade wine or are you bootleggers? I mean, do you have any homemade alcohol? No. We don't carry alcoholic beverages with us when the children travel with us. No. And you stayed here in these ruins. I'm telling you, last night it was a hotel run by Mr. and Mrs. Graves. See, the problem with that is this hotel burned down years ago. It was struck by lightning and is so far out of the way that by the time the fire brigade got here, there was nothing left. And unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. Graves died in the fire. I'm telling you, we stayed here. They even gave us a basket of food. They gave us a basket to carry with us. Nevada, bring that basket. And Nevada brought the basket out, and they sat on the ground and opened it. But lo and behold, there was no food. Very carefully, Dave reached in and pulled part of the contents out. It was a robe, a very soft robe, a very luxurious robe. And it was monogrammed Graves Hotel. The deputy looked at him, looked at the robe. He said, "I'm not saying that I believe your tale, but I'm about to put my siren on. I want you to turn your tiny home around. And when I put my siren on, I'm going to gun my engine, and both you and I are going to leave this place like bats out of hell." And that's the end of my tale.
Baba C. I've driven in those Texas storms, and I remember I was driving Trudy Terry, who is occasionally on the there's an East Texas teller, and we've been to Galveston, and there's a causeway from Galveston Island to the mainland, and I was driving, and there was one such storm, and I was in a hire car, and of course, being Texas, it was hot, and the rain's coming down, and the windscreen misted up. And it was dark, and I couldn't find the controls. I daren't let go of the steering wheel, and I couldn't find the demister. And I'm driving down. I can hardly see a thing, but I'm the front vehicle, and there's a whole row of vehicles behind me, following me, thinking I'm leading them to safety. If only they knew.
Well, John, when I was pretending to be a child, and I say it that way because when I was born, the elders in the family said I was an old soul that had returned, and that I could see, I had a veil over my eyes, that I could see things and hear things that other people could not. And we used to drive down south for us, And sometimes we were on these winding roads that went up a mountainside that were barely wide enough for one car, but there was two-way traffic. And I remember one night we had to drive. We had no choice. My aunt's boyfriend, I think, was driving, and we were driving up a road. I'm not gonna say it was very narrow, and these trucks would come zooming down like they must have known by memory the roads, and we were cleaving near the edge, and we made our way. Finally, we made our way off of this little narrow road, and I found out the next day that had we just gone a little bit further to the left, we were on the sheer side of a mountain. And so there were no rails to keep you from going over. Had we gone too far over, we would have gone straight down the side of a mountain. And that has always stayed with me. And to this day, when it storms, well, actually, I like lightning storms and I like thunderstorms as long as I'm not in them. But as I said, I never dismiss other people's tales of spirits, fairies, or house elves, because I've experienced a few of those too. But that's a tale for another time.
Cass, thank you very much for running things tonight, because Mike was too chicken to listen to all the stuff. Yeah, he just wussed out, didn't he? He just didn't want to be that scared. Thank you, Ali, for driving the magic carpet. And all it leaves is, well, have a fantastic All Hallows Eve, Halloween. We got some stuff coming up this week. We've got Tuesday, and as many people as can get there, we'd love to have you there. We have our young tellers. Now, someone contacted me from Argentina and said, could they bring their students, but they were over 18. Was that you, Catalina? No, I must go through my emails. I didn't answer it. As soon as I've answered it, I mean, usually it's 18 and under, but then I will say, yes, she can bring her students.
That would be great.
But I can't, I've got to go back through my emails. It was one of those emails that I didn't answer straight away. But so for this week, it is just going to be 18 years and under, young tellers from around the world. And we love adults to come to that to support them, because they really do appreciate that. And Simona, bring some more students back to me. And so we regularly have young tellers from India, from Gaza, from Nigeria, UK. Occasionally they come in from Italy if someone brings them, and then that's and
Palestine,
and from other places.
Palestine.
Yeah, I said Gaza, Palestine, Gaza. And so that's Tuesday. On Friday, we've got a real treat. We've got, assuming that she can get somewhere with internet and she's not stuck out on the road in the United States with her thumb up, we've got Mariana Marin from Mariana. Where'd I get that from? Juliana Marin from Colombia, and she's currently hitchhiking around the United States. And she has this big sign that says "Traveling Storyteller" that she holds up in the road, and she's going to be doing our stories for children on Friday, and that's going to be a real treat. And then I don't know what's happening. I don't think we've got anything on the 31st on next Sunday, and I probably won't put anything on because there'll be live storytelling all over the world next Sunday. So and then we just return for more Tuesdays with the young tellers, more Fridays with people telling stories for children. And the next worldwide story round will be we're on 24th today, aren't we? So it'll be the 7th of November. So And if I can work out a way to get there, I shall be getting ready to go to Morocco on the 8th to get ready for the storytelling festival. But I have to go via a third country at the moment because they are not letting flights in from the UK. But for now.
Hey, John, I have one quick question. Do you know if flights from the States are being allowed into Morocco?
Yeah, it's only the 3 countries that last week were UK, Germany, and Holland, and by February it will have all changed again. Hopefully everything's going to be back where it should be by February. We've been in touch with the Moroccan embassy, and it's a temporary thing. They just didn't, while they weren't sure if the vaccine worked with the new variant, they just closed the places with the new variant, just got closed off. And because there was going to be so many tourists coming this week with being half term. So that's the reason behind it. But it's, Morocco needs the tourists. So I think it'll all be, we're all holding our breath, but just being really optimistic for February, because the power of all you storytellers on the world will make sure February happens, because no one mucks about with the power, the cosmic power of half a century of 50 storytellers and their supporters. But for now, have yourself a fine Halloween, All Saints Day, Day of the Dead, whatever you're celebrating, and whichever veil you're choosing to pass. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, and thank you all. It was wonderful.
Thank you, tellers.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you.
I've lost my.
Until the next time, John.
Until next time.